Hello and welcome to the CFM Digital Badging Project, Level 2 Drivers of Change, Assignment to Spotting Events. We've already reviewed the three major categories of forces that shape our path into the future. We've got trends, which are slow, continuous forces that go in predictable directions, up or down, less or more of something. In this assignment, we're going to explore events, the discontinuities that can knock us off course into alternate possible futures. And we are going to be looking at three categories of events. The first category are scheduled events. These are things we know will happen, but we don't know the outcome. So, for example, a presidential election. It's tremendously important who's the winner. We know when it will happen and about when we'll find out the results. And we do have some pundits that are very good at predicting what the outcome will be, but we're not sure until it's actually happened. Then there are events that are highly likely that we know in some period of time it's going to happen, but we don't know exactly when. However, since we know what's going to happen, we can explore in a fair amount of detail what the consequences will be. So, for example, we know sometime in the next century there's almost certain to be a major earthquake along the San Andreas Fault in California. And thanks to geologic modeling and disaster preparedness, we have a pretty good picture of the kind of damage that could result, and we can get ready for it. But we don't know if we're going to wake up tomorrow and find that that's happened, or wait another 25 years. The third category is wildcard events, things that are possible but have a low probability, so we don't spend a lot of time thinking about them sometimes, but they can have very high impact. Sometimes these arise from the collisions of a natural disaster with human error. So, for example, the meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. That was a result not only of a severe storm event, which is something that, like an earthquake, is kind of predictable because we know we're entering an era of increased severity of storms and more frequent severe storms. But what made it really disastrous on top of the tsunami damage was the fact that between the way that the nuclear power plant was constructed and the way it was being operated, it could not withstand that kind of storm. Even though in retrospect somebody might say, well, that was totally predictable, usually these events, which are also known as black swan events, after a book by that name of Nicholas Taleb that looked into these kinds of things, even though in retrospect it may seem that you could have foreseen it and some people may actually have written or talked about it, it hasn't been taken seriously enough to be explored in depth. I am going to take you through a brief overview of one or two disruptive events in each of the five steep categories: social, technological, economic, ecological, and political change, to give an example of how these events, punctuating the underlying trends, have had an effect on museums and their communities. So first of all, social or cultural change. I'm going to point to two events. First of all, the landmark decision Brown versus the Board of Education, which overturned the principle that separate but equal education was sufficient and appropriate under constitutional law, and the subsequent integration of the Little Rock Central High School in 1957. This sparked the Little Rock crisis, which was when 9 students were prevented from entering the racially segregated school by Governor Orville Faubus. And then President Eisenhower intervened, sent in the National Guard, and it turned out to be one of the most important events in the African American civil rights movement. Well, of course, museums have a tremendously important part in continuing to both foster an integrated public space and in terms of interpreting our history so that people can learn and reflect on what we've gone through. And you have everything from museums like the Newark Museum, which was one of the earliest museums to have a race-blind admissions policy back when many public institutions were still segregated, to the Museum of the Confederacy, which struggles with continued issues of managing a perception that links their identity and their mission to an image of segregation. Technology. When we looked at trends, I mentioned the conflating trends of increased sophistication of 3D digital printers and lowered cost as being something that was fueling an industrial manufacturing revolution. Well, within that trend, a notable event was the introduction of the MakerBot Replicator 2. When I woke up and read that you could buy a fairly high-quality tabletop replicator for just $2,000, that seemed to be a notable event fueling this trend towards affordable, widespread 3D printing. This has effects for society as a whole. So, for example, we now can do much more personalized biomedical devices. This is a little girl who was born with a genetic defect that made it impossible for her to manipulate anything with her hands because she didn't have sufficient strength. But her doctors worked to create a personalized 3D digitally printed armature that supports her arms. So it's a personalized robotic assist device. And as she grows, they can reprint, they can modify and reprint the pieces so that it continues to adapt to her growth spurts. Here's a beautiful example of 3D printing being used to fuel personalized high-tech medical devices. Museums, of course, are all over 3D printing. This is a hackathon at the Walters Art Museum where people came in and did digital scanning and printing with artifacts from the collections. Ecological events. Well, storm events, of course, are tremendously traumatic. Under the underlying trends of increased severity and frequency of storms, we have specific events like Hurricane Sandy, which had a tremendous impact on museums and other cultural institutions, as well as their communities up and down the East Coast. And how have museums begun to respond to Sandy and similar disasters like Katrina? Well, the foundation of things like the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and increased training and awareness of what needs to be done to come together as a field and help our colleagues out when there's a disaster so that there's enough people trained and mobilized to go in and do effective and appropriate salvage and stabilization work. Economic trends. All right, again, how does a trend punctuate and in this case fuel a long-term trend? The mortgage and loan crisis of 2008 and the subsequent collapse of the stock market. Well, we were already sitting on a long-term historic trend of a decrease in government funding. You can see up here in about 1989, we had a state for about a decade of the average or median amount of government support, state, local, federal, to museums being on average about 40% of the operating income of museums. But that started to fall in the mid-90s and had been on a downward trajectory ever since, getting to the point before the mortgage and loan crisis where it was on average only about 20% of operating support for museums. Well, the economic crisis of the last few years has only exacerbated this since local state government have fewer incomes from local sales taxes and have a smaller tax base. They're cutting back their support for museums and cultural institutions even further. So there's a case where a specific economic event is fueling a long-term trend. Last of all, political events. I thought I'd focus on the Occupy Wall Street protests that began in September 2011 in Zuccotti Park. Now, this was a general event that was showing people's frustration in the wake of the financial crisis with perceptions of economic inequality and a feeling that the rich were not doing their share, but it also focused on museums. And there were specific actions against museums. A subgroup called Occupy Museums pushed back against government support for what had been seen as a luxury that could be paid for by those using their services. They were characterizing museums as being for the 1%, as being elitist institutions. And you even had specific museums, like the American Museum of Natural History, where people came and did a Occupy protest because of the funding that the Koch brothers had provided for the Dinosaur Hall. And of course, the Kochs are noted conservative billionaires who fuel and fund a lot of conservative causes. On the other hand, you have groups like the Museum of American Finance swooping in and saying this is a piece of history. We need to be on the site collecting artifacts that reflect this moment of time. Okay, so museums responded to the Occupy movement both as subjects of protest, as agents interpreting and collecting the protests, and also as places that tried to provide reflection and civic dialogue to talk about what was going on. Your turn. Your assignment for this level is going to be to identify events in each of the three categories. 2 scheduled events where the outcome is unknown, 2 events that are likely to happen, and you may be able to foresee more or less what the outcome would be, but you don't know exactly when they would happen, and 1 wild card event, something that is definitely possible but not highly probable, but because it would have such a severe impact if it happened, it's worth looking at. And for each of these categories, for the 2 scheduled, the 2 likely, and the 1 wild card, you're going to identify the event, give it a title and a description. And remember, these are fictional things. They don't have to have happened yet. I look forward to see what you submit.